There we go.
There we go. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. I'm great. Thank you.
So, Professor Hicks, for those of you who don't know you, why don't you go ahead and do a little self-introduction?
Sure. Well, I've been teaching in the cinema school for about 11 years now, I believe. And uh, the course I teach is called CTIN 401, User Interface Design for Games. So we really do a great overview for those who know nothing about UI and UX, all the way to people who have played with it a little bit. And it's a great course. I learn more about the students and about games than I think I teach, because it's just so fascinating to work with all the young minds at USC. And now I've just this year I just started working with the AGP group as well, the Advanced Games Project. So we're working on improving the UI and all of those games too. So it's been a really great journey.
Great. So today we're focusing on the topic of Black History Month, obviously. So to you personally, what does this concept mean?
I think now it means something different. I think when I was growing up, I'll be 50 this year, to give you some context. So for basically the last 48, 49 years, it's just been a month to kind of learn, one, that, hey, we were slaves once, and two, we maybe invented peanut butter. So it was never something that, that I was like, looking forward to necessarily. And then when I had my first kid, my son, I remember he went to, he had Black History Month in his elementary school. And basically that's what my takeaway was, is just to remind everyone of their place in the caste system. Now, obviously the summer of George Floyd changed everything. But I think just in general, as I've been getting older, I'm just becoming more and more like Afrocentric. And it's not because, I think it's because society is sort of pushing me in this direction, where it's sort of like, growing up, I just considered myself, a Black American, really American. But then I think over the last, maybe even 10 years or so, I've definitely been feeling a lot more Afrocentric. And it's been great to like learn about Black History Month, really, or just Black history in general, rather, kind of through Instagram. Like there's just so many great accounts that, give you tidbits of information that you just, like, for someone like me, just didn't have growing up. My aunt was very active in Chicago. I was from Gary, Indiana originally. So was my grandmother as well too. My aunt was like in Operation Push. So she was always kind of like in my ear about Afrocentricity, but it was just something like, I just felt like as an American skateboarding kid wasn't like that important. But with society being so polarized now, I think it's become an important thing for me. And just knowing like, hey, we're more than just, peanut butter.
Which I thought peanut butter was invented by Canadians, because I'm Canadian. So I'm really appalled at this information.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, I think the jury's out, but
okay.
Yeah, there've been many more great contributions other than that as well too, which is why I think, Black History Month now has like a unique significance.
For sure. I think this is a great bridge for, actually, I think this is a great, pioneer for a lot of different cultures to come together and celebrate themselves in a way that weren't really allowed before, or weren't really seen by the mainstream media. And as a professor, as an artist, how do you think that your identity, intersects with you being a Black person?
Well, I think that the thing that other people probably who are not Black probably don't understand is the amount that sort of racism plays in your life. So it's not always, like these like kind of overt, like being called N-word or something like that, but it's like, a lot of kind of just constant microaggressions. So you would think as you get older, oh, you might build up a greater tolerance to this. But what happened is, what I think is, like, as you get older, it just starts to eat away at you more. And racism can drive you crazy, So, and to answer your question, it's kind of like, I remember I'm thinking back to my time in art school and the kind of art that I was making then. And even that was just sort of about, you know, being like kind of the other outcast, and then over, you know, kind of call outs to like, hey, this is racism. So I think as an artist, it's always been, unfortunately, in a lot, you know, once you start making your own art, it becomes, for me at least, it was like kind of at the forefront of what I was trying to express a lot. And even when I was kind of creating stuff that wasn't directly like, hey, this is me and my Black experience, there was some aspect of it that I was either like sort of, you know, poking fun at the art world or, you know, just sort of being rebellious in that regard. But yeah, I think it's, and you know, for me, it's pervaded a lot of the work that I do as an artist. Now, as a commercial artist, it doesn't really surface that much. As a matter of fact, it's funny because over the last few years, I've had clients tell me like, "Hey, like make it more diverse." Like even me, so I'm like, you know, I'll like turn in like comps of things with, you know, what I assume is what, you know, they've always wanted for the 30 years that I've been creating stuff, you know. But so society is changing. I think it just depends on ultimately, you know, if good is going to win out. But yeah, my artwork is definitely influenced, I think, by being a Black man in America.
So in terms of change that you mentioned, do you, and you've been teaching for a long time, so what
Mhm.
have you seen the changes happening in the past in terms of, you know, being you know, Black History Month promoting um, Black excellence, Black
Mhm.
creatives, and what kind of changes do you hope to see in the future? So two different timelines.
Well, clearly there needs to be, you know, a real kind of reckoning of just history, because the history that I learned was not the history that has been surfaced to date. So, you know, looking back on it, like kind of history I learned was really like kind of propaganda, right? Again, to kind of reinforce the tenets of the caste system. And I keep mentioning that because there's a great book by Isabel Wilkerson called Caste. Don't remember what the subhead is, but it's about really sort of dissecting the caste system in America, you know, that is based on race. So I think that, yeah, I think the caste system is like really something that up until now, history just in general that we're taught in schools, and then especially African American history, it's just been there to reinforce. So there's been kind of a great, I think, a awakening almost in terms of what the real history is, right? And so it's not always. I mean, it's complicated, but I think it's something that, you know, we need to be taught. And luckily, you know, my son, he's 18, so he's gotten a little bit of an update of this kind of new history. So I'm hoping that in the future that we're just aware of, you know, of our history and where these biases might come from, and like, you know, how, um, you know, even if, you know, you're not actively being racist, that it's still affecting your life in a negative way. So I hope we get to some kind of utopia at some point.
Do you think that's happening in the video game industry and or the interactive media industry?
Well, I'm starting to see some progress in the video game industry. I mean, the video game industry has a lot of problems. I mean, I'm sure people know about the recent scandal at Blizzard, makers of some of my favorite games, which was about sexism. So the video game industry has a lot of kind of catching up to do. You know, to me, it's really about making sure that, you know, Black people have representation on like every level, from marketing to engineering, like even more importantly, to you know, creating, you know, new AI algorithms that don't display bias. So I think the video game industry is catching up. There have been a couple of things. I don't know if you've heard of the afrohairlibrary.org, where you know, this artist is generating basically an open source library for African American hair, which has always been a problem across all video games. So it's just getting started, but I believe artists are starting they can submit their work, and she's going to build a gigantic open source library. And then, you know, thinking about you know, greats like, you know, Jerry Lawson. This actually, I saw his documentary on Netflix. Jerry Lawson basically invented the cartridge for home computer games. And I just remember thinking, like, as I'm now like kind of approaching middle age, that man, if I had known that when I was a kid playing Space Invaders, that could have really changed my life. Just knowing that that was possible, seeing another Black person do that. But, again, that wasn't something that, we were taught. So, and not that it was on the school system to sort of teach us that. There was just like no kind of, I don't know, there was just no sort of amplification of like, our real great contributions to society. So just finding that out now later in life is still inspirational, but I wish I would have known that from a younger age. So I'm just hoping that, history gets, gets taught correctly on every aspect of it. And I think we'll grow as a culture from that.
And do you think that has been reflected in the more recent student body versus the students that you taught before, that their confidence or their awareness of the representation?
I'm not sure, honestly, because in my course, we don't necessarily, it's just my course is so kind of, technical in the sense that, we don't really get into, I think, this conversation at all. What we do talk about, though, are things like about, accessibility, and then just kind of equality in general, because these are things that, need to be handled at the user interface level, right? We need to account for people who are disabled in some way. And then we also just need to, in general, just sort of think about, having empathy for our user. Now, that's just in sort of my world. I think in the larger world, there's a huge conversation to sort of be had around this. When AI is gathering information, it's gathering information from the current data set that, a lot of it is probably incorrect. We were just talking about history, for instance, or it might be biased. So, are those biases built into the new technology that is going to basically pervade our lives, right? So it's worrying. So we can see it from things like when you go to wash your hands, the little laser eye that's looking for a hand, isn't attuned to like darker skin. So you're sitting there and the thing's not working, right? So that's just like a small thing that we have started to notice. But to me, it's, it could be the canary in the coal mine that's pointing to sort of bigger issues about, bias, built-in bias, and having representation just at all stages of the new technology.
Okay. So our last question is a bit more fun. Who is a Black hero from either real life or virtually that inspired you?
Well, I did mention Jerry Lawson, so that was a great, inspiration, I think, in terms of, the world of video games, just knowing that, hey, we have a legacy in one of my favorite activities. Then as an artist, I was a child of the 90s, so I was a huge fan of Warhol, Haring, Basquiat, even Kenny Sharp, who's like painting cars now. And just that whole sort of New York pop art scene really sort of like influenced me. And that's the sort of painter that I wanted to become. But as I became more and more of a commercial artist, out of necessity to sort of pay bills, I took all of those kind of art historical learnings from all of my greats. But I'd say, yeah, I'd say Basquiat for sure. And then there's several modern artists as well.
Are there specific stories that you could share of how, that translated into your creation and your, journey?
I think so. A little bit about me, just going back, is I was interning at ad agencies since I was like 15 years old. So I came to the world of advertising at a very kind of unique time as it was sort of becoming digital, right? So in my time there during the like late 80s, early 90s, we went from doing everything by hand to doing kind of everything on the computer. So I learned all of the like old school master ways. And so when the computer came along, I think I was a little more intuitive about kind of what needed to be done on like a classic level, just in terms of, typography and incorporating photography into work, things like that. So I have all these old school design philosophies, but also I was young enough to have mastered the computer, right? So all of the what eventually would become like the Adobe suite of software, et cetera. So a lot of new designers, for instance, don't have like kind of like that old school training, so they don't necessarily, it kind of shows up in their work, right? It's just not as tight and classically trained. So coming from advertising, when it came time to go to college, I was, I wanted to do something else other than advertising. So I figured I would study fine art. So I studied fine art, painting, and sculpture at what was initially Otis Parsons, and then became Otis. Ironically, USC works with now and for creating artwork for the games department. So I did that, and I was just really sort of focused on becoming something bigger than a commercial artist. And towards the end, towards the end of my schooling, I started to incorporate the computer stuff I was doing into my fine art. And that was at a time when interactivity was becoming like a real huge buzzword. The internet was, relatively new. People were still doing like CD-ROMs and everything. So I started to express myself that way. And then that had a very like kind of immediate commercial impact in terms of, well, people need CD-ROMs for their music and for video games and things like that. So that was the beginning of my journey. And then I started working with video game companies as well too, and then I hosted a video game review show on FX, a segment on a show called The X Show. It's called High Score with Chevon. So my whole world has been always leading towards, using my artwork to create video games.
That's really cool. Thank you so much for your time today, Professor Hicks.
Sure, thank you, and I hope something good comes of this. And like I said, it's great that we're even doing this now, so I get to see recognition and people just trying to bring our different cultures together and not apart. So I'm all for that.
For sure. Thank you.
Awesome. All righty. Bye bye. Have a good